All right, Texan Rockers, without any farther ado, here is Faith and Doubt number one. I just want to make sure the last video saved, to my desktop before jumping into two. Uh, because over the years, I don't know if you know this, but Eric and I have been doing Texan Rock for 7, going on 8 years. It's just kind of this multimedia artistic vision that we had together, and we never stopped doing it because it's so fun. But anyways, there have been so many instances where we thought we hit record. We had like a banger session with poetry and rhythm, or a great discussion about everyday faith as a modern, and then we realized we didn't hit play, and so I like always double check. Okay, so Faith and Doubt 1. I'm just gonna kind of read this, and I may stop and comment if you want just the like stripped down written document. If you go to texanrock.com/blog, there's a ton of stuff. Like if you've ever listened to the show and thought, okay, so this happens to me. I will listen to shows or come across art, and sometimes, it doesn't happen for everyone, but sometimes I'm like, I want to download how that person thinks into my head. Like if I can see the world like they see the world, I want everything they've done to inform what I do. I think the blog's actually the best place to start. Like it's stripped down and honest and raw, and you can actually see my thought process like evolving through time. Richard Rohr's been like that for me. N.T. Wright has been like that for me. Geza Vermesh, David Flusser. There have been like scholar-media people that I've said, I want more of that. And so I just dive in. The blog's a great place to start. Okay, Faith and Doubt 1. Very few people doubt faith like a doctoral student in religion. I mean, first of all, you're placing anthropological rubrics over sacred texts, and that means asking how human beings developed ideals of God, how they craft imagery to represent those ideals, and how they tell stories to support the ideal of God that they came up with. Almost universally. If you've listened to the Texan Rock show, you've probably heard me say it a million times. Place any group of sapiens by a river, and eventually they'll start naming gods, and then they'll start worshiping them, and then they'll start trying to become them. The irony that starts to creep in and creep you out as you study religion as a scholar deeply is this. Those gods that people create as ideals and then try to image, they often end up looking a whole lot like us in the first place. They often end up looking like the people who made them. You might say we name our gods and then our gods name us. We cast out an ideal and then we follow it. And that's probably what drew me to the Jewish and eventually Christian conception of God over and against other beautiful traditions of naming the divine. Sure, I was raised with the Bible and at church every time it was open, and I developed this childlike faith. And that's what sent me to seminary instead of literary studies after college. I wanted to go as deep as I could into my tradition, more than I ever even wanted to be a pastor. And so in grad school, something started to happen. I began to notice this shift in how God was described. Specifically, that the conception of God became less human the later in time the text was written. Okay, pause there. So early on, the conception of divinity in the Bible, like you have to know how old the text is that you're dealing with. Sometimes you think you're reading a text that's later in time because of or earlier in time because of where it is in the Bible, but it's actually like a few hundred years later, and it's been popped into the text of Genesis or the text of Exodus, right? But the older you genuinely are in time with the text you're reading, the more God looks like a human except big, all right? So if you take Genesis, we have an Iron Age priest writing that God walked with Adam in the cool of the day. He means it. His God is a divine human writ large. He's like Mark or Eric, except big. He's like Karen or Kathy or Jermaine, except big. And so God actually visits the garden. He actually enters Eden, and he actually goes for a stroll. And when God asks Adam, "Where are you?" after Adam becomes aware of his nakedness and hides in shame, this version of God genuinely doesn't know. It's not a semantic game. Forget any preacher that tries to explain this away. It's a very, very old priestly source text, and there is no Trinity. God is not spirit. He is human, only big. And so he can be wrong, he can mislead, he can lose his shit, he can have a full range of human emotions. Fast forward to Bereshit, fast forward to Shemot, to Exodus. God is a storm deity descending upon Mount Sinai with fire and smoke and thundering commandments and shaking the earth. Holy, terrifying, but still physically manifested. And so this God travels in a tent, eats sacrifices. Like, he actually eats the sacrifices. He actually smells them and thinks they smell good. He gets angry, sometimes lethally so, as Vampire Weekend says, Yahweh's spinning 100,000 Israelites into nervous breakdowns. But this God is interesting to me because he's as violent as we would expect an ancient Near Eastern deity to be, but at the same time, he's starting to care about some very important ideals. He cares about justice, human morality, and he creates a system, like an entire sacrificial system, for dealing with human wrongdoings. This is off the map. The idea, like, every culture has sacrifice at this point. Like, the gods are angry, you need to make a sacrifice to make them happy. Great, check. Ancient Near Eastern deity. The idea that that sacrifice takes away human transgression or sin or the ways we've broken relationships with God or with one another or with the earth, that's off the map. Those are pirate seas. And I love that the Judeo-Christian tradition is starting to push on what is God very early on. By the time we reach the prophets, like Isaiah, who's actually like 3, maybe 4 writers, that writer starts to lift God even higher, describing the divine as seated on a throne above the realm of the heavens, because the world is like 3-tiered to them. There's the underworld, the our world, and the heaven world. He's surrounded by seraphim, or like these flying serpents with wings, and they're crying, "Holy, holy, holy." And by the time of 2nd Isaiah, who's later than the one who writes this vision, that's like Isaiah 40 through 55, we get this vision that's bigger than a local cult god. It's like during the Babylonian exile, God becomes not just Israel's God, but the creator of all nations. I think there's a quote in Isaiah that says, "It's too small a thing for me to just save the remnants of Israel." And then this vision gets cast that God's going to do something to bring all peoples of the world to himself. Again, that's like off the map. We're casting an ideal farther than any other system of thought about what divinity is. And so this God is not just a local cult storm deity. He's the creator of all nations. He doesn't need your sacrifices. He doesn't need cattle on a hill. He owns them all. He's the one who raises up and topples empires, and he speaks of justice for all people. And so this old man in a beard in the sky surrounded by fire-breathing dragons, which is what a seraphim is. You hear the root for serpent, right? It's not an angel. But this old man God claims to be not just for a particular people, but for all people. And so again, this is a new venture forward in Jewish tradition. If you jump again to Job, now God is almost unfathomable, frustratingly so. If you had to sum up Job, my Hebrew Bible professor, who I did my THM masters with, like my second master's, said if you had to sum up Job, it's a man complaining to God, "You took a shot at me." And God answering back, "Yep." But the divine voice cries out to answer Job's questioning of God out of a whirlwind, first of all, like a spinning tornado of chaos. And he doesn't explain the suffering that Job has gone through or the bet he made with Satan, the court litigant of heaven. Nope. He instead begins with this tour of the cosmos. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? This God is cosmic, transcendent, answerable to no one, which kind of sounds pretty close to the truth. In the Psalms, you get both. Sometimes you get this intimate shepherd that cares for his people with the same amount of effort and work ethic and consistency as a shepherd takes care of little lambs. Other times, you have this mighty king of glory coming for war. And in the wisdom tradition, like Proverbs or Ecclesiastes, God becomes kind of this moral force, almost a principle or an ideal more than a person, woven into the structure of the universe, like gravity or justice. A mentor I had in seminary named Brady Nemmers, he's a great pastor in Grand Rapids. He used to say, the universe has a groove. That's what wisdom is. Like somehow the God of the Bible claims to have set up the world so that there's a way that leads to life and a way that leads to death. And you need to follow the groove that leads to life. And so here's a question. Why? Why do you get such a wide variety of divinity in the Bible? Why in the Psalms alone? In the Psalms alone, you get every single picture of God I just ticked through that comes up in different Psalms. It's because the Psalms, like the Bible, are composed over 1,000 years of the Iron Age. And so you have every step of the evolution of God in this collection of hymns and in this book of poetry and law codes and stories in one place. It's been compiled together. Isn't that far out? So by the time we get to the New Testament, which, by the way, if you were even with your fingers to measure, the Old Testament's like this big and the New Testament's like, it's this tiny thing that fits between your thumb and your finger. And by the time we get to it, the language of God has changed entirely. Jesus calls God Abba or Father, bringing back this intimacy. But this time it's tied to this self-giving love and radical inclusion. At the same time, the Gospel of John declares that God is spirit, God is pneuma, or God is love, God is agape. Concepts that are profoundly abstract, nearly philosophical, and completely foreign to the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible that came before it. Paul echoes this cosmic transcendence, saying God is the one in whom we live and move and have our being. In some ways, God's existence predicates our existence, and were God to disappear, you would disappear in an instant, right? And Paul's saying at the same time, that's the hope we live out of. We can live out of the consistency of God to bring consistency to our lives amidst the chaos. This is literally nothing like the Old Testament. Well, why? Because it's Greek philosophy being stitched into biblical literature. Here's what's even more interesting. In both early Christianity and several movements of the first century, God becomes so transcendent, that is, so perfect and utterly unapproachable and unchangeable that he could actually no longer interact with humans directly. He's too holy, too other, and this is why the New Testament is full of these intermediary figures. Jesus as Logos, Spirit as advocate, angels as messengers, something or someone has to bridge the gap. Philo of Alexandria, who is maybe the most perfect example of a combination of Greek philosophy and Jewish like scriptural literature, he writes just before the birth of Christianity. He represents this beautifully. For Philo, God's utterly beyond comprehension, utterly without passions, untouchable by human weakness, but Philo does not abandon relationship with God. Instead, he inserts what? The Logos, the divine reason or word. It's not Jesus for him. It's kind of like this spirit bridge between heaven and earth so that the two can contact one another. The Logos becomes this intermediary force of God that allowed for creation to happen. Sound familiar? The New Testament writers take this concept and they call Jesus the Logos, right? And so here's the turbo button that will either help you a lot or make you mad. Probably not both. At least not at the same time. This all happened first in Greek mythology. Zeus gets elevated to the high transcendent god that can't touch creation, and every other god, whether it's Mercury or Venus in the Roman world, or whether it's Aphrodite or Hermes in the Greek world, these gods become intermediaries that can have human interaction. And so in some ways, the rest of the pantheon becomes angelic. A go-between between the chain of being, between divinity and humanity. I'm a poet by accident a lot of times. Sorry. But this process happens in Greek mythology, and then it happens in biblical literature or Jewish tradition. I could say a lot more about that, but we'll stop. Remember, though, in the New Testament, that scene where Paul and his partner come to a city and they think he's two of the Greek gods that have come to see them. And he has to assure them that I'm as human as you are, but I come in the name of the one true God. I think it's when he enters Lystra in the book of Acts. That's what's going on. The people think that the gods come down as messengers for Zeus, the head god. Okay? So, in both traditions, though, the Greek mythological one, which has conquered the whole ancient world by this time, and Judeo-Christian, God's become a being that you can't look at directly. You can't do it. You need a mediator, a voice, a word made flesh, a Jesus. This isn't a weakening of faith. It's a change. It's a theological evolution, okay? The divine became more abstract, more spacious, more holy, bigger, and therefore more inaccessible. But you can see that asking, like, what happened, or more so, well, what's God really like in the Bible? It's a moving target. The answer to that depends on where you jump into the story and what you're reading and what the author's ideology of God is. So who God is seems to depend on the era or the time, the location, and the ideology, or in Christianity we say theology, of the author. At first, this can start to feel like the ground is just shaking beneath you, okay? It can start to feel very vulnerable if you're honest. So what do? What happens when a seeker of God who once felt awe, trust, even intimacy with the divine because they believed the divine was rock solid when the rest of creation was not, discovers that even in his or her own tradition, God is a moving target? That who God is seems to depend on all these other factors. At first, it can feel like an earthquake. The God you loved as a child starts to feel like a collage or a mosaic of ancient voices stitched together by centuries of redaction and reform and adjustments. But then you need to just drink. Just kidding. Seriously though, here's the turn. It opens something up in your heart and in your worldview that's profound and beautiful and sacred, and honestly that allows you to appreciate any tradition and any naming of God, even outside your own. Okay? Because if God was never just one thing, then maybe your faith is never meant to be just one thing either. Maybe the truth is not in like nailing down this final form of God, but instead joining this long, honest lineage of wrestlers, Israelites in the truest sense, who take their faith seriously enough to question it. One thing I love about the rabbinic tradition is the questioning of God. God shows up in rabbinic like mashals or parables, or in rabbinic discussions of the law as a character sometimes. And there are even passages where the rabbis are having a debate about scripture, and God tries to weigh in, and they say, what? Stop it. Who are you to show up in the middle of our discussion? We're trying to discuss Torah, and you interrupted, right? There's this great tradition of like wrestling with God and honestly punching back. And that might get you farther sometimes. Doubt is not the enemy of faith. It's the threshold of deeper knowing. It's the gateway that the hero has to go through to enter their journey for a deeper, more profound, more prolific understanding of God. It's standing on the edge of Eden, not with fear, but with curiosity, asking not, where are you, God, but where are we going next? Where are we going next? Who are you going to be? Who are you going to be next? And how does that affect who I'm going to be next? Okay? All right, that's faith and doubt number 1. I hope it gave you some good stuff to think about. And as my partner in crime, Eric, always says, be good to one another.